Okay, let's move on to a few things to avoid in dialogue. Small talk. I've already touched on this, but I find beginner writers often tend to want to ease their way into conversations. So they'll start the conversation, for example, a phone call with a hi, how are you, how's your day, etc., etc. While that would be polite in normal in company, in dialogue, that's just boring because it's sort of redundant. We all assume that characters are going to greet each other. So if you do need characters to greet each other or open with small talk, keep it as tight as possible and move as quickly as possible into the purpose for the conversation. Repetitions. I do this a lot, and I often have to go back through my sections of dialogue and just make sure that I haven't repeated the same information over and over again. We do it naturally in real life. You know, we sometimes forget we've said something or we haven't quite said it in the way we want to. Unfortunately, we can't really get away with that in dialogue because it's just going to come across as boring to the reader. They're going to roll their eyes and go, but I know this already. Move it on. Go on to the next thing. So this also, sometimes we feel like we're saying something new, but really it's just the same thing in different words. So you need to really interrogate your pieces of dialogue and think, have I already said this earlier in the conversation or even earlier in the book? Is this information the reader already knows? And that pretty much goes for everything in your book. Again, readers are quite savvy. They will pick up very quickly information. I know sometimes we tend to think, oh, this is really crucial. The reader needs to know this. Just in case they didn't pick up that reference in the previous chapter, I'm going to mention it again now. The problem is that actually readers are quite savvy and they just get bored because they think, oh, this, person really likes to repeat themselves. Another thing to avoid in dialogue is dialect that is hard to decipher. Some literary fiction might occasionally veer off. For example, I'm just trying to think, it's been many, many years since I read Huckleberry Finn, but there's a lot of strong dialect in that, if I remember correctly. The problem is that often readers are impatient. You need to remember we're living in the 21st century now. Our readers we're competing for readers against Netflix, video games, YouTube. There are a lot of other things your readers could be doing other than reading your book. So you need to keep them as engaged as possible. And if you make it hard work for them, 10 to 1, they might just put it down and go and watch Swamp Murders, where they can actually hear the dialect and decode it much faster than trying to undo the phonetics that you've written on your page. If you want to get across that your character speaks in a strong dialect, use the odd word. We all understand if a Scottish character says, the wee lassie, we get that he's Scottish. You don't need to repeat it or write all of his dialogue in heavy dialect. The odd word here or there is enough usually, or a bit of a change in sentence structure is usually enough to give us a hint. We can actually start to hear the character's voice in our head, and we get that this is a person who speaks with a different accent or a different phrasing. Formal, stilted language. I will go into this a little bit more later, but I highly recommend that you read your dialogue out loud. I know sometimes it feels, especially if you're writing in a coffee shop or with family around, or you don't have a private place to work. And yes, people are probably going to think you're crazy. Maybe when you are alone, just try and read the actual written words that your characters are saying out loud, because you will very quickly hear if something is difficult to say or it sounds stilted.